Hi, I'm Paul Gibson. I'm the co-founder and co-director of Retake Our Democracy, an activist group located here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Statewide activities, advocacy at the Roundhouse, and election strategies as well. And I'm here today with Eric Shimamoto. Eric developed a PowerPoint presentation that describes how the New Mexico State Senate operates. And I'm more or less going to just be the foil here, every once in a while chiming in with dumb questions, because this is really Eric's show, Eric's research, and it's going to blow your mind. So with no further ado, it's a high bar there. All right, Eric, tell them what you're going to tell them.
So I've been calling the presentation "Fix the Senate," and that grows out of the fact that I spend a lot of time at the Roundhouse during legislative sessions, just advocating for the things that I think that are best for New Mexico, and talking to senators and representatives. And over the years, there's been some success and some failure, but in 2019, the game was completely changed. It was just a completely different legislative session than we've seen in a long time.
Well, we had a Democratic governor. We had the House was really strongly, not just Democratic, but a lot of new blood of young progressive representatives. I think everybody had their hopes up.
Absolutely, and part of that is because we did a lot of work to fix the House of Representatives in the 2018 election.
Right.
And frankly, we had a lot of success, but we also had a lot of stuff that we got through that newly transformed House that just ran into an absolute brick wall in the Senate.
Right.
Things like funding early childhood education. Everybody saw what happened with the Abortion Decriminalization bill.
Community solar.
Solar
Tax credits. I mean, the list is actually quite long.
Yes.
Of bills that, and also instances like with the minimum wage, where the minimum wage came out of and tax fixes. All of these came out of the House with very progressive solutions that got pared away significantly. And they were still a gain, but they were a gain on different people's terms, not ours.
Absolutely. So that's where we come down to the idea that what we need to do is fix the Senate. And so I just started looking at who's in the Senate and what's the problem, and that's kind of what this is about. So for starters, we look at what the composition of the Senate is in New Mexico by party, and you see that we have a 26-16 a Democratic Senate.
Yeah, on the face of it, that looks pretty darn good.
Yeah,
but that's not the way it really functions, is that right?
What that represents basically is what letter was next to these people's names when we voted for them.
Right.
It doesn't really necessarily reflect how they vote when they get to Santa Fe.
Okay, well, let's see what you're thinking there.
So I think the actual composition of the New Mexico Senate is probably accurately represented by this slide. There are a group of senators right there in the middle of the slide who I've tactfully labeled as fake Dems. And they're the corporate gray dots in the middle there. And I say there's 8 of them. That's an estimate, I think roughly 8. We're going to talk about who we think they might be. But the problem is that once you've got a block of folks like that who are willing to caucus with the Republicans, and they do caucus with the Republicans every year on one of the most important votes of the session, then there's no longer a Democratic majority in control of the Senate, despite what New Mexicans elected. So, but I'm not here just to talk about the problem and complain. I'm here to talk about solutions. So I'm going to take a quick detour and tell a story about what happened in New York last year when they had the same problem and they fixed it. And the problem in New York was called the Independent Democratic Conference. And what that was 8 senators who were elected as Democrats but who caucused with the GOP every session to hand control of the Senate's committee system and therefore control of the whole legislative agenda to the minority party, to the GOP.
So that's interesting because it's 8 Democratic senators. I seem to remember that number resonating when you were talking about New Mexico.
Yeah, that's a coincidence, but yeah, it's a very similar problem. But the way that things got fixed in New York was that a group of New Yorkers got together to solve the problem. Mm-hmm. And the group called themselves No IDC-NY. And IDC was an abbreviation for the Independent Democratic Conference.
Right.
And they did that deliberately. They were branding this group of senators with a name that you could say and talk about easily. And so they were calling them the IDC. And that's important, that we make it possible for people to talk about what the problem is easily. And so toward that end, they created these logos. That
So
are
it
on
wasn't
screen.
just like 8 disparate races, and they just happened to support each other. They all ran under this one brand, if you will.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the idea was to put together a slate of candidates who would run against those specific 8 senators
Okay.
who are doing a specific thing. This isn't just about dinos, and I have no problem with anyone who wants to address the problem of dinos in the New Mexico Senate. But this is a group of senators who are doing something quite specific that we can fix.
Mhm.
And so the same thing is true of the IDC.
So what did they do in New York?
So the first thing they did was they created these logos that are on screen so that you could look, so that people could identify what it is that they're talking about, that there's something called the IDC, that it's a problem that needs to be fixed, and so they're doing branding. But the branding that they're doing is not just marketing branding. When I say branding, I'm also talking about the older usage of the term when you talk about cattle. They were labeling the senators who were doing this thing, so that people would know, oh, you're a member of that group, oh, you're one of those folks. So that's really important, that we identify who we're talking about and that people not forget that these are the folks who caucus with the Republicans.
So they didn't start off with like, here's a long list of bad votes these folks had. They were
Nope.
zeroing in on something you're going to get to in just a second.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So, and then also on this slide, there are a bunch of hashtags that they used in their social media, that no fake Dems, true blue wave, shame on you. That's all great messaging, but it's not doing the same work as the branding. So I want to point out the branding is really important because where it
Okay.
gets you is the ability to talk about the problem. And this next slide kind of demonstrates that this is just a meme that they used in their social media
Right,
in the No IDC
right.
campaign. So it's a
Get
standard.
that down in there.
Yeah. It's a standard slapping Batman meme. And it's got Robin in there, and he's naively saying, oh, well, the IDC members can't be all bad. All of them sponsored the single-payer bill.
Right.
And Batman gently reminds Robin that sponsoring a bill doesn't make it a law. You have to vote for the bill. And that as long as the IDC members were caucusing with the Republicans, the single-payer bill would never get a vote on the floor because it dies in committee every year.
Right.
And that's exactly the way things are working in New Mexico right now.
Exactly.
And you could substitute for single-payer any
The Health
host of
Security
them.
Act, anything, yeah.
Right. So once you're able to have these kinds of conversations with voters, and you've got a conversation going about what the problem is, the next step is to actually run campaigns. And in New York, the No IDC-NY folks recruited a full slate of candidates to run against the members of the IDC.
Okay.
And so that's what's on this slide. And you see at the top, there were statewide candidates who also endorsed this campaign. So you see Cynthia Nixon and Jomani Williams and Zephyr Teachout at the top. But more importantly are those 8 Senate candidates,
Okay.
each of whom was running against an IDC member in the Senate.
And they were explicitly aligned together, too.
Yes,
Okay.
they appeared at campaign events together. They had a joint launch of this campaign actually in New York. And another important thing to know is that in order to get this endorsement and be on this slate, each of those 8 Senate candidates had to take a pledge that when they got to Albany and they were going to cast their vote for who's in charge in the Senate,
Right.
that they would cast that vote with the Democrats,
Okay.
and that they would not caucus with the Republican Party.
Okay.
So they all make that promise and they all get on this slate, and it's a joint campaign.
Right. Right.
So then what happened was the No IDC-NY people ran a campaign just making sure that people in those districts knew what was going on. If you live in an IDC member's district, you need to know that your senator is caucusing with the Republicans every year. And the only solution to that problem is to replace that senator in the primary. So they did online and they did mailers, but just basically reminding New Yorkers of that fact. And it wasn't just online, they also had campaign events, they had protests, they showed up when the candidates had, at primary events, they would show up and make their presence known so that everybody knew what was going on. And one of the things I love about this picture on the left is that I'm not even sure whose campaign event they're at. It's got the
Right.
IDC report card, and you can see people further back that have signs talking about fake Dems. But it's all about defeating the IDC. It's not about what
John
senator
Arthur Smith
you
and
like.
Mary Kay Papen.
Exactly.
But we'll get to them.
Yeah. Anyway, the end result is that it worked.
Mhm.
And so I love this image too. This is a tweet from the New York Times Twitter account on primary night in New York, September 2018.
I recognize her.
Yeah, so that picture is Alessandra Biaggi on the evening that she defeated Jeff Klein, who was the chairman of the IDC. The thing that I love about this tweet is the pull quote. She's not talking about Jeff Klein. She's not talking about herself. The pull quote actually is, "We have just cut off the head of the IDC snake," which is absolutely what she did by beating Jeff Klein. But the important thing is she's still talking about the IDC. The point of this campaign was to remove enough members of the IDC that they could not act in coalition with the Republicans to take control of the Senate.
So what happened in New York after that?
Well, so...
Or is that later on in the slideshow?
Yeah, we'll talk about it later. But
Punchline comes later, folks.
the answer is that a lot of good things happen.
Yeah.
But before we get there, let's come back to New Mexico for a minute.
Okay. I recognize that place.
Yeah, I've been there a few times. And in order to tell the story of what's happening in New Mexico, you could go back decades. You could actually go back to the 80s.
Edie Feldman does go back decades in her book.
Yeah, I've read that book. It's a good book. So you could go all the way back to the 80s and the Cowboy Coalition, which I think she talks about.
Yes. Great book.
I'm just going to go back to one decade, to the election of 2008, which you may remember was a pretty good year for Democrats. We elected Barack Obama president that year. We also, in New Mexico, we flipped 4 seats from red to blue in the New Mexico Senate. We sent a Democratic majority of 27 to 15 up to the roundhouse for the Senate. And we elected some kind of exciting young progressives. Eric Griego, Tim Keller, Steve Fishman, Eleanor Chavez, were all elected that year. So there was some real energy that some things could happen, that things might be different. The first thing that happens after an election of note is that the Democratic caucus, all of the newly elected and the re-elected senators, get together as a party, and they decide. They make various decisions, but the important thing is that they decide on the leadership of the Senate. They want a floor leader, they need a majority whip, and they need someone to be president pro tempore of the Senate, who is the highest elected official in the Senate. And in December of 2008, after that election, they got together and did that, as they always do. And the person they settled on for the pro tem position was the recently departed Carlos Cisneros. And that's a compromise choice, right? Everybody in the Senate, everybody in the Democratic caucus gets together to who would be most acceptable to them. And you would think, with a 12-vote majority, that whoever the Democratic caucus chose to be the pro tem would be elected on the day that the Senate first convened. So in January, on the first day of the session, that's one of the orders of business that they have to take care of, is they have a vote of the entire Senate to elect the pro tem.
So it's the Republicans and the Democrats vote.
Exactly.
And this is where the problem arises.
Right. So it's the full Senate elects the pro tem, and then they organize the whole Senate after that. Anyway, you would think with a 12-vote majority that someone who had the support of the Democratic caucus would be elected, but you'd be wrong. Instead, what happened was we got Tim Jennings, who was the most conservative Democrat in the state of New Mexico.
Right.
And the way that happened was Tim Jennings had the support of every single Republican in the Senate, plus 8 Democrats who crossed the aisle to vote with the Republicans. And so then Tim was pro tem for the next 4 years. And he was only pro tem for the next 4 years because he lost re-election in 2012, when the good folks of Roswell decided that they'd rather be represented by a real Republican than a fake Democrat. And that is how Cliff Fertal and his glorious libertarian beard got to Santa Fe. But that creates a vacuum in leadership.
Right.
Because Jennings is no longer pro tem. So following that election in 2012, December 2012,
Democrats caucus again.
They have to caucus again, and they picked Pete Campos.
Okay.
Another compromise choice, but he's the man supported by the majority of the Democratic Party.
Okay.
At this point, we're really just singing the second verse of a song that we already know. And in fact, it's not even going to be a surprise. This is an article from the Santa Fe New Mexican from December 2012. saying that a conservative Democrat from Las Cruces named Mary Kay Papin is going around acting like she's going to be pro tem.
Okay, and the typo there, Papins, is not yours. That's the New Mexican editorial staff.
Yeah. I assume that she really wasn't a household name yet.
Yeah.
And that little typo kind of demonstrates that
Right,
fact.
right.
But, so, we know what's going to happen. The interesting thing is how it happened. After having a kind of embarrassing a vote 4 years earlier where they had the party divided, they decided basically not to go through that again. So on the first day of the session, Pete Campos walks out onto the floor and withdraws his own name from consideration.
Mm-hmm.
And then he...
By acclamation.
Yes, right. So then he nominates Mary Kay. There's only one candidate. There's no reason for a roll call vote when there's only one candidate, so she's declared pro tem by acclamation. Exactly. And so that is how Mary Kay became pro tem. And then 4 years later, 2016, they just gave up. They didn't even try. No alternative was suggested. The Democrats just accepted that Mary Kay has the votes, so she's going to be pro tem, and there's nothing anyone can do about it.
So what's the big deal about the pro tem? Why is that a problem?
So the pro tem is really important because the pro tem controls the committee's committee. First of all, by being pro tem, she's automatically the chair of the committee's committee. And then two, she gets to appoint 6 other members of that committee. And there are only 11 members on the committee, so that's a 7-4 majority if she appoints folks who are going to agree with her on stuff.
Mm-hmm. And it's the leadership of the Senate are the other four. So it's Worth and
Right.
Amy Stewart, and I don't remember who
I don't
the
remember
two
who the
Republicans
minority-
are,
Yeah, whip and leader.
but two
yeah.
Republicans and 2 reasonably solid Democrats, and then she appoints the rest.
Exactly.
And let me guess, this doesn't play out well.
Not generally.
Yeah.
It hasn't. So, and the importance of the committee's committee, which we didn't mention that yet, is that the committee's committee hands out every committee assignment to every senator in the Senate. Not just the chairs, but every single member of every single committee in the Senate. And you have experience with the committees, so
Mm-hmm.
you understand how important that is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the report card covered that in great depth. I mean, it's like there were very few actual votes where our bills were killed. HB 51 being one of the few. Most of them were bills that were just not heard in committees because committee chairs just decided they didn't want to deal with it. So let's see how this plays out in terms of the committee structure.
So wait, let's start by talking about who the folks are that are those gray dots in the middle of the chart.
Yeah, okay.
Right. So, and this is important because if the way that the pro tem can take control of the agenda is to have some allies that she gets to appoint to committees, she needs to have some allies to begin with. And if she's getting her position because she's got a handful of allies who will vote with the Republicans to put her in charge, well, then that would suggest the direction everything's headed, right?
Well, it would also suggest that there was a payoff. I mean, not a financial payoff necessarily, but that something good had to happen to those Democrats by virtue of supporting Papin.
Yeah, a little bit of horse trading.
Right.
So the first question we might ask if we're trying to figure out who those 8 corporate gray dots in the middle of the chart are would be, well, who voted for Tim Jennings, right?
Right.
Like that would be a good place to start. Now, they're not all still in the Senate, but the folks who voted for Jennings are George Munoz, John Arthur Smith, John Sapien, Mary Kay Papin, and Linda Lopez. Those are the current senators.
Linda Lopez I wouldn't have predicted.
And that's the reaction I always get. Linda Lopez, generally, I frankly, we're on the same side of most stuff. And so the thing that I would say is that she voted for Tim Jennings, and that happened. And so here she is on the slide, and I'm listing her that way. But this is one data point.
Right.
And we'll go through some more.
I believe she became a chair.
She chairs the Rules Committee
Right,
now, and
right.
she did get that appointment while Tim Jennings was still the pro tem. So, but like I said, she's generally been a good senator. I think she's representative of her constituency and the people in New Mexico.
Right.
So we'll just take each data point as it comes.
Okay.
And move along.
Oh.
I might pause for a minute and let you address this. the second list of folks who I would look to is just who do people think is the problem, you know? And so we take our democracy's report card.
Right. Well, we identified Clemente Sanchez, John Arthur Smith, Mary Kay Papin, George Munoz, and Gabriel Ramos as likely members of that coalition. We also had issues with Campos, Richard Martinez, and the late Senator Cisneros, but that was really zeroed in, focused on the abortion decrim vote.
Yeah,
but these folks, you know, especially the first three, I would say, Clemente Sanchez, John Arthur Smith, and Mary Kay Papin, they just have their hands in so many bills that died without a vote. It happened over and over and over again, and while our organization is really zeroed in on the 8 who voted against abortion decrim, those same folks have their hands all over a whole lot more than that.
Yeah.
So that was some of the stuff that we identified in our report card.
So I think that's a good list. I think that those 5 names are pretty involved in some pretty suspicious stuff in terms of acting like Democrats.
Right.
And I will point out that 3 of the names on that list, John Arthur Smith, Mary Kay Papin, George Munoz, were also on the last list. These folks voted for Tim Jennings too, so you can start to see a pattern developing.
Yeah.
Then I also wanted to, just try and look beyond, the most obvious suspects, and I thought one thing that you could do to figure out which Democrats are most likely to be the ones crossing the aisle to vote with the Republicans on the first day of session would be to just look at, well, who's in the habit of voting with Republicans throughout session.
This is one of the things that really impressed me about this work, is you just really dove into some deep stuff to get to this. So show them what you did.
So there's no recorded floor vote on the pro tem, but there are 460 floor votes that were taken in 2019. And so I just thought I'd look at those. Now, unfortunately, the majority of those votes aren't real useful because they're unanimous. Right. So the Senate passes a whole lot of memorials acknowledging the cuteness of puppies, when declaring February 15th to be Valencia County Day.
Right.
And while I have absolutely nothing against puppies or Valencia County, that's fine. Those votes don't tell me anything about the way that the senators behave. So I had to set all of those to the side. So what I did was I started by looking at what I called close votes. And I defined those as anything that either passed or failed by a margin of 8 votes.
Okay.
And I chose 8 specifically because in a 42-member Senate, a bill that passes by 8 votes or fails by 8 votes has passed or failed by a vote of 25 to 17. Mm-hmm. And there are 16 members in the minority party, so...
It requires somebody to move.
Right, somebody crossed the aisle one direction or the other. Could have been 8 folks crossing the aisle.
Right.
But basically, that was a way to find the votes where somebody crossed the aisle.
Okay.
So that turns out there are 20 votes, only 20 out of 460 votes that were actually close.
Okay.
And then I actually also had to throw out 3 more of those because my criteria was to look at votes where Democrats joined with the Republicans. And in three of these, there wasn't actually a Republican majority that I could identify. The Republican Party was split on both sides. Okay, so that left me with 17 bills that were close and that they either passed or failed on the basis of a handful of votes in which
Democrats joined with Republicans.
Democrats were that handful of votes, one way or the other.
And what do we find?
So looking at those 17 bills, here's the first 9, and that's just those bar graphs show, on the left blue are Democrats and red are Republicans, and you can see that there's a consistent pattern here. These are the bills that failed, but it was close. And on the far left you see HB 51, so people probably know what that is. That's the Abortion Decriminalization bill. A lot of these were not big news items, but I want to make this clear, I wasn't looking at these bills in terms of what's in them. I didn't decide any of these are good bills or bad bills. I just know that these are the bills where the Republicans all voted one way and a handful of Democrats joined them.
Okay.
And so, and you can see that pattern right here. You can see that, there's a group of Democrats who are voting with the Republicans, and that's the reason that these 9 bills failed.
Okay.
And then here are 7 more bills that are or 8 more bills, sorry, that,
Same pattern.
same pattern. These are bills that passed,
Okay.
but barely. So you see like SB 8 is in there, which is handgun background checks. And you can see that it only passed by a couple of votes, and the reason is that we've got this pattern again, where there's a group of Democrats who are crossing the aisle to vote with Republicans.
Okay.
So once you've got this data set and you're looking at these bills, the real thing that I'm interested in is the votes that are inside those circles.
Right.
So it's a simple enough thing to just throw all of the votes on all of those bills into a spreadsheet and sort them.
And so who are these culprits?
Right.
Let me guess.
There you go. So it's a lot of the names that we've been talking about. And I just point this out, like look at Clemente Sanchez and George Munoz there. They're voting in close votes, where a handful of votes made the difference on passage or failure of a bill. They're voting with the Republicans instead of the Democrats 77% of the time. They're more likely to vote with the Republicans than with their own party. And you could go down the line then. John Arthur Smith is at about 71.5%. John Sapiens at 69-ish. Gabe Ramos is at 65. Jacob Candelaria is at 60%, and Mary Kay is at 56%.
The thing I would point out there too is though that Mary Kay Papin she doesn't have to wind up taking many bad votes because she gets it all done behind the scenes.
Well, they all do, really, so it's
Yeah.
kind of dramatic, right? I mean, like I said, there were 460 floor votes, but only 20 of them were close.
Right.
Right? That says something about how successful they are at keeping the stuff they don't want on the floor
Exactly.
off of the floor.
Exactly.
HB 51 was really an anomaly, that it got to the floor, even though...
Well, the word I had is that Peter Worth expected it to pass.
Right,
That he
right.
or would not have gotten to the floor.
That's right.
And I think that's the reason why it may not be introduced in 2020.
Right.
Is that there's, it would use a lot of time just to come to the same result.
Mm-hmm.
And in a short session, they don't have time.
Mhm.
So let's see what else you got here.
So, again, looking at these patterns, you've got 4 of these folks
Right?
who voted for Tim Jennings back in 2009. 5 of these folks are on the retake list. And I think basically that the folks who have a circle around them right now, those 6, I want to focus on them. I think that those
Are your 6?
are your 6. Well, there's 6 of the 8 or so, right?
Mhm,
And I just say there's 6 that I'm sure of. And I didn't mention that the other 2 faces who were on the screen a moment ago were Joe Cervantes and Richard Martinez, both of whom voted with the Republicans an awful lot, but they were just under the 50% mark. So at least they
Right.
voted with Democrats more than Republicans.
Okay.
So let's assume for the moment that these 6 names are
Okay.
are 6 members of the coalition that keeps handing Mary Kay the gavel
Okay.
so that they can control the agenda. What's the first thing that you'd expect them to do if after electing Mary Kay?
Well, they'd wind up with positions on committees they wanted to be on or chairs of committees they
Right.
wanted to chair.
Well, let's see if that's what happens. Let's start with the committees
The
committee.
drama's killing me.
So that is the makeup of the committees committee. And I should say, from here on out, if you see a gray dot on the screen, it represents one of the 6 senators that we just named.
And so this is a 7-4 majority for the Republicans, essentially.
Basically,
Okay.
exactly. So those gray dots are Mary Kay Papin, Clemente Sanchez, George Munoz, and John Arthur Smith. And when they join with 3 Republican votes, they can control the outcome of any decision made by the committees committee.
And that includes decisions for appointments to committees. And
That's-
so what we're probably looking to see here is that as a result of this one vote that created this one committee, we wind up with a Senate committee structure that's basically a landmine. Well, I'm suspecting that's what we're going to find.
Yeah, so not all Senate committees are created equal, right? So what
Right.
you would expect is for them to definitely take strong control of the most important committees.
Plus, there's 2616, so there's, in an ideal world, they should pretty easily control every committee.
It could get close, let's see.
But that's not what happens.
So,
Wow.
so most people, everyone, would agree that the Senate Finance Committee is the most important committee in the Senate. I would argue that corporations and then rules are the next most important.
Right.
you could get some debate on that, but I'll tell you why I think of it that way. I mentioned earlier that there were 460 floor votes in the Senate. There are also 499 bills, more bills than got voted on, that got referred to a committee and never came back from that committee.
Right.
So colloquially, we say they died in committee.
Right.
Exactly. So 499 bills died in committee in 2019. Of those 499, 179 died in Senate Finance, 90 died in corporations, and add those two together, you're talking about 269 bills. We're already more than half, right? So what I just said is that Senate Finance and corporations combined killed more bills in 2019 than the rest of the committees on this slide combined.
Okay. All right. So then you're saying that like over half of the bills died in committee, and that was certainly at those two committees, and that was certainly our experience with the retake bills.
Right.
But what about these other committees? As
So-
you look at this chart, it's like there's only two committees that are really controlled by Democrats, maybe three.
Well, so the coalition, just those 6 senators that we're talking about, controlled Senate Finance, Senate Corporations, Senate Rules, and Indian Affairs. And then remember that the couple of senators at the end of my analysis, Cervantes and Martinez, who didn't cross the 50% threshold, and I'm not sure that they're part of the coalition, but just as an example of how 8 senators could take control, look at where the 2 of them are. They are both sitting on judiciary and conservation. One of them chairs each. And so at this point, you're looking at how 8 senators can control 7 out of the 9 committees in the Senate. And basically, this is how you could have a Senate in which you basically need the coalition's permission to write a bill.
And that's, one of the things we found, because it's interesting that judiciary and conservation now get bumped up into this group, because that's where the majority, we had 11 climate change related bills. That was, we called that the issue, not an issue. And all but one of them died in committee. Mm-hmm. And it was almost always one of those 2 committees, almost every single time. And so, when we start thinking going forward about the critical need to create, a just transition, to pass community solar, to get the solar tax credit through, all of those kinds of bills have to go through these committees, and they just don't. And when your conservation committee, say it again, is the one that's killing the most of the conservation bills, that's a problem. That's a problem.
And as you know, a bill, in order to get to the floor, to even have a floor vote, generally has to go through 2 committees.
Right.
So if they're controlling 7 out of 9, there's basically nothing that gets through.
Right, you better go through Indian Affairs and Public Affairs, or Education and Public Affairs,
Yeah,
or you got no hope.
So that's, as I see it, the problem. And after I made this slide and I did these charts several times, it occurred to me that just looking at that those look like tombstones, and that is entirely appropriate. That what you are looking at on that screen is the graveyard where good bills go to die.
Yep. That was our experience. So what are we going to do?
So that's appalling, but it's also good news.
Because we know who the culprits are.
That, and also when I say fix the Senate, we don't have to fix the whole Senate. We just have to fix this.
Right.
This is the problem that's holding back the majority of the Democratic Party agenda.
Okay.
The Democratic Party platform is not being enacted because of this.
And I'm guessing that what your plan is to kind of replicate what they did in New York.
Kind of.
It kind of helps to have seen the slideshow.
Yeah.
I'm not just clairvoyant.
So, and I do want to point this out. If we're talking about 8 senators, they need 5 of them to control a majority. 5 of them joined with 16 Republicans,
Okay.
creates the problem. So, I'm sorry, they need 6 to have a majority. With 5, they create a tie, which is a whole other interesting situation.
Then Howie comes to play.
Exactly, then the lieutenant governor breaks the tie. But, not on the pro tem vote, though.
Oh, really?
The lieutenant governor does not have a vote on the pro tem vote, so if they tie, it's back to the drawing board.
Okay.
But, for present purposes, just doing simple math.
6 people they need.
There are 8 of them. They need 6 to control a majority. So if we replaced 3 of those 8, they'd no longer have a majority. If we replaced 4 of those 8, then we'd put them down so they couldn't even create a tie.
And so this is where you and I have had discussions, because I think we have to think more broadly than that. I understand the criteria of what we need to conserve resources, and we can't go after every Senate Democratic leader, but there are some that weren't part of that 5 or 6 that could easily step into that role. I could imagine Joseph Candelaria, I could imagine Sapien, although he's on your list.
he's on the list.
I could imagine any number of Campos. I could imagine any number of other senators just going, well, you know, I could probably work with these Republicans pretty well too. So, but as a good start, that 6 seems like a good start.
And you're describing how I identify 6 senators, but in reality, I think there are probably 8, that they could pick up a couple more votes, basically.
Right. And of course, the other way is, and I know this is something we've all been talking about, is another way to fix this chemistry is to take out a couple of Republicans. And I know
So
that
long as they're replaced by folks who do not join this coalition.
Right, exactly. Okay, let's go on.
So now I'm talking about 6 senators who I think should be the main focus. And just real quick, I added this slide because people always ask at this point, well, where are they? So just a quick slide to show you where each of these senators is from. Mary Kay's down in Las Cruces. John Arthur is to the west of her, from Deming. Gabe Ramos' district is huge. Is he from Silver City?
Yeah, Silver City's got a big group there.
Right, so that's a man. He's also got most of the Gila in his district. North of there is Clemente Sanchez. He is personally from Grants, but his district stretches all the way from the border over to Los Lunas, Bosque Farms.
Yeah, who drew these maps?
Well, that's a whole separate issue. And just north of him is George Munoz, who is from Gallup and represents a district that kind of stretches a little ways up the Arizona border there.
Okay.
And then John Sapien is off all by himself over in Sandoval County, just north of Albuquerque.
Okay.
Otherwise, it's one big contiguous landmass.
Of trouble.
Yeah. And so one of the things that people say when you talk about these folks is, well, are they representing some conservative areas that, you know, I mean, they have to represent their
That's
constituencies?
certainly what John Arthur Smith told us when we went and visited with him.
Right. So like, well, you know, shouldn't you cut them some slack? And the answer is that, yeah, John Arthur is an exception.
Right.
He does represent a conservative district.
Right.
But that's the exception. For the most part, and this is the presidential election results in 2016, for the most part, these are actually districts that lean or are heavily Democratic. You can see John Arthur down in the bottom left there. Trump did win that district. But Hillary won all of the other districts except for Clemente's, which was basically a tie. And then if you jump forward to 2018 and look how Michelle did against Steve Pierce, you see that it's even more dramatic.
Right.
That Michelle won Clemente's district. She won all of these other districts, again, except for John Arthur's. And some of them, you know, by 30 points, right? These are 2-to-1 Democratic victories.
Right.
So what I want to say is, for the most part, the answer is no. These aren't people representing conservative areas that have to vote conservative, you know, to keep their constituency happy. What these are people who have to call themselves Democrats in order to get elected.
Right. And then they behave as Republicans.
Exactly. So, and then the one more of these just showing, and this one I didn't put percentages on, I put the raw numbers of vote totals. This is the Democratic primary from 2016, and you can see how many voters show up for a Democratic primary, and you can also see how close the margins are. If you average these together, the average margin of victory in Democratic primaries in these districts was less than 400 voters. So these are winnable primaries. Go back to the previous slide, these are winnable general elections. So I don't think that we should be embarrassed or afraid to try and fix this problem in these districts.
So has anybody stepped up?
Absolutely. There are folks stepping up, and we are still, I mean, we're taping here in October of 2019, so there's still plenty of time for folks to step forward. But so far, 4 of the senators that I'm talking about out of my 6 have challengers, and there's some good, strong challengers.
Right.
The other 2 in District 9 and District 4, that's John Sapien and George Munoz. We're waiting to see what happens. I'm expecting someone to come forward, and 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 if you're that person out there in District 9 or District 4, in the sound of my voice, then, you know, I know some people who
Would like
would
to talk
get
to
behind
you.
you. Yeah, who would absolutely want to help. So that's good news, and I think we're moving in the right direction. The one thing that I want to make sure of, and I feel very good about these candidates who have stepped forward, but I want to know that they are not going to be part of the problem in the future.
Right.
I want to know that they are not going to go coalition on us the way that the people they're replacing hopefully have done. So I think that we ought to be asking them on the campaign trail, hey, are you going to vote with the Democrats when it comes time to elect a pro tem?
Isn't that what they did in New York, too? They
Absolutely.
said they had to sign a unity pledge.
They signed a unity pledge to get the endorsement of no IDCNY, and I think that we should do something similar. So this is, you know, my version of a unity pledge.
Okay.
There's nothing magical about these words, but basically what it says is that when you cast your vote for leadership, you're going to cast your vote with the majority of the Democratic Party. So that would have meant that you would vote for the person who was supported by your own party going into the legislative session.
Might have been a good thing to have for HB 51, too.
Yeah, well, you know, honestly, I think if we take care of this leadership vote, the
Right.
other things take care of themselves in a way. So the good news is that this can absolutely be done. They did it in New York, and we can do it in New Mexico too. And when they did it in New York, to answer the question you asked a little while ago, the result was a flood of legislation being enacted that had been passed by the General Assembly in New York and blocked in the Senate over and over and over. In the 2019 session in New York, all of these bills that are on the screen right now passed the Senate and ultimately became law. And for anyone who's aware that New York has a 6-month legislative session, so they can get a lot done in 6 months, I actually and deliberately have picked an out-of-date list. This list is the bills that were passed within the first 2 months of the legislative session in New York. So this is representative of what we
they
could
could
do
do.
in a 60-day session in New Mexico. You just get there's just all kinds of bills that we have passed through the House
Yeah.
and that are waiting for the Senate to sign off so that they can go to the governor's desk.
So what can people who've been watching this slideshow do?
So I would suggest, one, if you find this informative and you think it's important, share this video with people. Let people, I'm trying to start a conversation about what we're calling the corporate Democrat coalition in New Mexico, right? That they're doing the same thing that the IDC did in New York, and we need to educate people in New Mexico the same way that people in New York were educated.
So the most important thing is, don't just watch this, wring your hands, and get pissed off. You got to get active.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The other thing, we're recording this in late October.
Right.
Within a few weeks, there should be a campaign launching around this exact group of senators.
And there's going to be a website,
Right.
correct?
So, assuming that you're watching this video sometime after the second week of November, go to nocdc2020.org and sign up there to get alerts from that and to find out what ways you can plug in and help out in your own neighborhood or however you can help out. Also, I mentioned this, but if you're watching this video and you don't know, get on nmlegis.gov and find out whether one of these folks is your senator.
Yeah. And, there were a lot of people who've been in conversation with Eric. Eric did all the work on this PowerPoint for sure, but the folks at Retake Our Democracy, at Working Families Party, at Indivisible Nob Hill, and the Progressive Democrats of America all have been very involved in kind of formulating strategy around trying to replicate what we've just seen successfully implemented in New York. But it's going to depend on you